practically involved, obviously, understanding how some of these services are then provided by the health and social care team, which is including midwife, nurses, and in some cases the consultant or the doctors if you've had a C-section. So the main part was that we were looking at studying the stages of development from conception to growth, and I think the video that was a brief video, but it kind of gave us an understanding of what we discussed in a summary, that this is what we need to look at when we discuss, what are the early years of development, specifically in the case of, a child, when we look at the conception to pregnancy to post-pregnancy stage and delivery. Now, in today's learning outcome, we're going to be focusing on understanding the stages which we see from birth up to 7 years. And here is where we're going to be looking at, some assessment criteria, which are going to be focused on understanding, what happens when obviously, we see, say, for example, children growing, from the age of 1 up until the age of 7. And what are the key critical components that we look at when we talked about the 4 important theories yesterday? One of the theories which, specifically focuses on relating to the development of child, essentially was on the fact that Wachotsky's theory, which basically focuses on cognition, neurological and brain development, speech development, language and speech development essentially leads to the development of language and communication. And then we look at the physical, the ABGOR chart that we looked at, which is the chart in which we track the growth of the child from the age of 0 to 12 months, from 12 to 24 months, and then 24 to 36 months. And the synonymous use of the Red Book, which is normally a book that the doctors, the GPs, and obviously the health visitors typically look at, for maintaining track and record of the immunization and obviously the growth pattern which the child is showing. And here, the sense of that particular book is to essentially, spot any sort of irregularities if we do get to see, which is happening in the case of development of a child. So today's focus would be to understand and relate that to what we did study in terms of the socio-cultural theories, and obviously the theory of cognitive development is basically looking at relating them to the development of a child. But in the development, we don't want to be looking at lots of things. We need to be focused on understanding cognitive abilities. We need to be looking at neurological and brain development, language and speech, physical attributes in terms of enlargement of obviously the body structure, and some of the signs which do start to come up. Say, for example, sometimes children are born bald, or they have very little, cranial hair. So in some cases, the hair growth which tends to happen, the patterns, the soft skin starts to, wither away in some areas, specifically when you look at this cranium or the skull. And these are the physical aspects of it, what we're going to be looking at in terms of, studying assessment criteria 1. We'll also be looking at personal, social, and emotional attachment, which the child actually creates with the mother, the parent, the near family, and obviously how these things help and aid in the overall development and growth of the child. The second part that we're going to be understanding is a term called holistic development. Now, this is a term which normally we get to see and being used in very many different contexts. In the case of teaching, for example, I can quickly relate. Holistic assessment is what we focus on to see whether the learning outcome is totally met, and or even if some of the assessment criteria are 1 or 2 are borderline, but do we get to see that overall is the knowledge and skill which the learner is required to adapt, has that been done, and is it doing justification to the work and the criteria defined in the learning outcomes. Similarly, when we look at holistic development, what we are focused on in this case for the child is looking at social, emotional, physical, mental, and intellectual growth from that perspective. So when we talk about some of the aspects that we are going to look into a bit more detail, which is personal, social, and emotional, we will add intellectual and mental to it. And that would be looking at a holistic approach in terms of how we see, development happening. And the emphasis on the importance of physical, emotional, and psychological well-being of a child is something which is of interest when we do discuss holistic assessment development in the early years with regards to this. And then last but not the least, we'll be looking at, what are the factors essentially which explain how children's development essentially happens. And this bit is again, important is because of the fact that when we do look at, the, let's say the, how do I put this? Say, for example, when we look at various systems that the person, gets access to, when we look at from a children's perspective. So here the idea would be to look at one of the systems that you inherit is genetic. So genes and some of the traits, whether the child starts to look and appear closer to mother's appearance or father's appearance, or is a mixed appearance. So when we look at the factors which essentially are going to, let's put it this way, affect the development and influence the development of a child. In some cases, we look at, making sure we understand what are the systems or the ecosystems, I would put it this way, when the child actually grows and develops. So some of them could be genetic, some of them could be environmental in terms of the kind of surroundings the child is in, and some of them could be nutritional in terms of the, patterns of feeding, or for example, in some cases, the type of food. And then overall aspect in terms of influence which the children's development have is from the influence of parenting and caregiving. And that is a concept that we'll be looking at in terms of how parents, are essentially, let's say, coached on initially during the pregnancy period, when couples are, advised to attend classes or get some classes just to understand how, to look at changes that are going to effectively happen in their life when they do have the child, after the pregnancy and after the delivery in their day-to-day routine. So those are the bits that we'll look at very briefly in terms of, the third assessment criteria, which is explain the factors which essentially, influence the child's development. So let's go into some bits of this in terms of discussing by looking at some of the PowerPoint slides. I am going to be augmenting some of the PowerPoint slides, as well. And then, as always, for each learning outcome, there are a few handouts that I use primarily for the purposes of delivering and teaching. And those are the ones that I'm going to make available so that you're able to, obviously read them to get a bit more knowledge and detail or depth in terms of what we're discussing as far as the assessment criteria are concerned. So here in this case, let's look at one particular activity, because what we want to do is understand the sequence and stages, in the development of the child after birth. So one such thing that I have got here is on the screen. It talks about, could you briefly look at, visualizing that, assuming if you were working with a newborn, or if you were working and obviously nurturing a baby who's probably at the age of 1 started to crawl and obviously standing up or trying to stand up and gain some sort of an equilibrium or balance, and then start to walk. What could be the type of things that you normally see in a child, which typically happens from the delivery stage when the child is born to the year 1? Could you visualize some of the changes which typically happen within the children? Any ideas, any thoughts? So when you look at, say, for example, the development of children in particular, what we are looking at is we are going to be looking at identifying some of the key stages that we think we will look at, in terms of how the development typically happens for a child. So I look at a setting within, for example, in that setting, what I would normally do is look at a child probably going to nursery, or maybe for the first 3 months, the child is normally at home, and the let's say the child is growing, and is basically just in a pushchair or maybe in some sort of a baby cot. And in those cases, the primary things that you would notice is that the baby would start to develop and grow here. They would start to do some basic movements of hands, movement of eyes. They will start to recognize faces. Their patterns in terms of sleep, and obviously in the first 3 months to 6 months, you would generally have the baby only sleeping and being fed, which is either breastfed or bottle fed in terms of milk. There is nothing in terms of solids that you can introduce for the first 3 months. So it is just the baby's mother's milk or the fed milk, which is normally fed to the baby, or the powder milk, which is normally fed to the baby. And in those cases, the baby is going to be developing sleep patterns. Obviously, in some cases, you would look at these patterns being, abruptly broken by the baby starts crying even though the eyes are closed, but the baby starts crying because it's feeling hungry, or it has had a sore back or wants to turn over. And what we normally do is, in some cases, the baby has been fed. You would normally make them sit and give them a bit of let's say tappings on their back to be able to help them digest the milk that they've had. And in such cases, you would normally see this routine carrying on for the first 3 months. Now, after the first 3 months, or first 3 months to 6 months, when we look at, what you are going to see is maybe more movements, which the baby is able to do, starts making a bit of noise, different types of words, response to when you put your finger, move your eyes, they start to follow things. They start to facially recognize the mother and the father, or the person who's basically taking care of them. And then you would generally see that the child is able to sit up and sit down, sit up. And sit up would mean basically, although they do not have the ability to maintain posture, but with the bit of support, the child is able to sit up. And then patterns in terms wherein in feeding patterns, you start to include some solids, and they would essentially allow the child to grow and the systems in the body, physical growth to happen. 6 to 9 months, you would generally see that the child starts to become a bit more active. The feeding and the sleeping patterns are more or less, let's say, are set to a particular routine. They start to eat a bit more solids. They start to make a bit more noise. And obviously, in some cases, when they are going from month 9 to 12 or 15 months, you generally see the children starts to balance. They start to experiment the environment around them, and they start to play with toys and other bits which tend to happen. And this would allow them to be a bit more entertained, and in some cases they participate, and voice modulation starts to happen. That means the child starts to speak a few words, and these words tend to be words that they are picking up in terms of sound and phonetics when you speak or when you talk to them, and they are able to turn around, look at you, give you attention, and those kind of things tend to happen. Now, if I look at development from 1 year onwards to 2 years, you would generally see that the children at that point in time are focused on developing trust. They look into your eyes, they would attach, start to form some sort of an attachment or an emotional bond. And this would be the bit that they sense, they try to get a sense of in terms of some, I would say, sense of social security or some sort of security that they would want to have. And this allows them to build trust. So sometimes when you have the baby and you swing the baby around in some sort of, say, for example, a way, then they trust you entirely to say that, okay, I'm not, my mom or, whosoever is holding me will not drop me off. And, they tend to have that trust on you. And they're also trying to gain by touching things. Everything goes into the mouth, everything they try and put into the mouth. And the reason why you see that is because they're trying to develop sensory and motor skills. And these skills would be that they want to test everything, they want to trial out everything. And in some cases, you would generally see that everything goes into the mouth. They want to touch and, feel and taste some of these things. And this tends to be development of their sensory and motor skills, which is happening because depending on the environment they are in, generally at this age between year 1 and 2, parents would normally create a small bit of a play area on a carpet or on a floor, and have some cushions and other bits around the baby, so that if they lose balance or they fall, then the fall could be cushioned, and the baby does not get hurt. And what you do is you normally spread a lot of toys around, different types of articles, objects around, which are not sharp objects, but objects which the child would love to experiment and play with. And those are the bits that you generally see happening in terms of, the early years from year 1 to 2 or year 1 to 2 and 3. Now, what we also get to see at some stage is that this particular approach, which parents put the child in terms of a certain situation and in a certain area, which could be a play area with a certain amount of objects and toys, is to basically help in ensuring that the environment, the children understand the environment, and when they understand the environment, they're also, the environment is helping them to develop their senses, which is touch, feel, smell, taste, and sound. These basic senses are being, developed when the child is in this particular, let's say, environment. The other bits that we look at in particular, when we talk about, stages of development, what we are looking at is that we would want to know that the child is also developing what is called cognitive abilities. And this is where they are starting to process information using their mental capacity or their brains, essentially, to retain, acquire, and, know their surroundings. So in this case, they would experience, by crawling or walking to certain places within the house, try and gain confidence. And this particular, cognitive development, which we talked about, tends to be, helping the child essentially, look at, I would say in the early years, helping them to develop skills which are going to be important at a later stage when they go into nursery, to help them develop reading, language, vocabulary, numeracy, and writing, and identification of the skills. So this part that we talk about in terms of cognitive development is in the early child years, is very important, because this allows the child to essentially think, explore, and figure out things by using their senses. And in this developmental stage that we normally talk about, we make use of Jean Piaget's theory, wherein his cognitive development theory, which is widely recognized and used, it divides the development of these years into 3 or 4 vital stages. And these 3 or 4 vital stages, as per his developmental theory, focus on 0 to 2, wherein the child is focused on developing the sensory and motor skills, which is called the sensory motor, wherein the infant or the child learns about sensory experiences. For example, they start putting, as I mentioned, things into their mouth or objects into their mouth to develop their senses of taste. They think everything is eatable. Everything is something which they can put into their mouth. And that's why you would normally have, in some cases, child mittens and, children hand wearing gloves and things, so that they are away from any sort of infections or any sort of contamination which can happen when they are exploring the, environment. The other tends to be the pre-operational, phase, which he terms as pre-operational. That is from ages 2 to 7, and this is where children learn through pretend play. So a lot of role plays typically tend to happen when we do these pretend plays. Essentially, these are done primarily in the nursery by the parents, by the teachers, by the carers, and this pretend play tends to, focus on helping the child develop, let's say, their thought process, and help in essentially developing the language that they will be speaking, or essentially using when they are conversing, and obviously let's say playing with other children or other children in the same age group. Now here, basically, up until the age of 7, what we are looking at is children should be able to think about things symbolically. So in the nurseries, you would normally see the teachers would, if they talk about something, they will normally have a visual sign. If they show something as a picture, as a figure, as a diagram, they'll normally have it on the paper and say, okay, this is what it means, or this is an apple, or this is a fruit, or this is a vegetable, and things like that. And this is allowing them to understand the difference between, remembering things, and also using sometimes their imagination, because when teachers break them into doing activities, okay, let's do this exercise of drawing a picture, or drawing an object, and they show an object and ask the child to draw. So you're looking at the child developing memory, using the memory part of it, and then basically bringing it out in terms of putting it to a bit of test. And then we have the concrete operational experience, which is normally between the age of 7 to 11. And in this, what we are looking at primarily is, you know, the child essentially, when we look at this part of it, the child essentially is, focused on not just the basic aspects of it, but some of the physical activities which tend to typically happen, and they would be related to, the experience that they would want to gain by doing things themselves. So this is about concrete operational experience or stages, and these stages or activities which are done predominantly by the children is to make them sit on the table, making sure that they're able to understand that this is dinner time or this is food time. They are made to sit and, obviously go through some of these activities when they play in a tub or have a bath, or, those kind of activities which are predominantly done under this stage tend to be, ensuring that the child is able to, develop some of these, activities. And these activities, when they look at developing, they are also doing it out practically themselves, which would mean that their behavior, their interaction with their parents in terms of the general, society or the people that they are around, and last but not the least, factors which are going to be helping them essentially in understanding their environment a bit better are the ones that are going to be covered in the concrete operational, part of it. And obviously, formal and operational, some part of it, you'd also see that at the age of 5, the children go into nursery. At the age of 7 to 11, you generally see children going through primary school, and formal operational being, in this case, the children are going through high school, and they are getting proper academic, qualifications, going through the school system, and they develop a sense of, they are fully developed in this case, and they are able to then look at, when we talk about the formal operational age, here the cognitive development, typically which starts at the age of 11, has fully, developed into a logical, I would say, thinking process, rational thinking. They have the ability to be able to synthesize information. They have their ideas, which could be sometimes abstract ideas, but these ideas, they are able to develop ideas, and obviously in some cases, because of the academic rigor in the curriculum that they're going through, they are able to also hypothetically look at some of the workings of these ideas, and they tend to be characterized in this particular, the fourth operational stage, which Jean Piaget actually explained. And the main part of this is the main significance, if I put it this way, is that this particular framework of Jean Piaget actually helps, understand that why is it that during, say, the adolescence to adulthood. So in this case, if I look at 11 to 16, adolescence to adulthood, what we're going to see is that there will be a comprehensive development happening of the human body, or in this case, the child, and that would be typically helping them transform into an adult. And these stages that we go through and understand are crucial milestones in understanding the cognitive development, which is basically the mental abilities, of the individual, thereby enabling the child to tackle wide range of challenges, situations, and in some cases, develop, obviously the focus is on helping them to develop problem solving skills. And those bits are a part of, this particular framework. So when we talk about phases of development, and we talk about these phases of development being divided by Jean Piaget into four areas, they tend to be 0 to 2 years, 2 to 7 years, then primary schooling, and then secondary schooling, and that being then leading on to the transformation into a adult stage. Now, some of the milestones that we need to be aware of when we talk about this particular stage is to look at identifying, let's say, I will put it this way, that I need to say that you would need to look at Jean Piaget's theory, look at these four stages, and identify maybe in a table using it to say these are the main set of activities which the child would do between these stages. So you'll have to put on a thinking hat, you would do a bit of research, and that would be by using, say, something like this as a table. So you have these four stages, but here in this particular part of the table, what you're going to do is essentially write down what are the changes in terms of development that you get to see, which is happening within the child. And that is what I would, suggest that you do in order to detail them out a bit more, apart from the handout which I uploaded yesterday, which is Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory. And this particular part can also be referred to in a link which I will put it, and that link essentially would allow you to let's say go into a bit more detail. And then once you have understood the four major parts of it, then the idea would be to start looking at, when we talk about sensory motor skills, that would mean that the child is looking at physical movements, looking at trying to develop the speech to be able to speak. They try to communicate by using hand gestures and other means of making sounds. And in some cases, not in some cases, in all cases, the child will also develop social and emotional attachment with the parents, and obviously the individuals that they get to see on a daily basis, or in their environment. And this part is quite important, because at the end of the day, when we look at the stages and the sequence of development which happens from birth up to 7 years, we would be looking at four particular areas. One is cognitive development, and that would be covered by the Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory. And then we would also be looking at the stages which he has classified, which will further help detail out how the child development will happen, specifically focused on 0 to 2 years and 2 to 7 years, because when we talk about early stages of development from birth to 7 years, which is the unit, the focus is on the first two phases, which is basically sensory motor and pre-operational. And those would be the set of activities that we need to document and list out to understand the stages and sequences of development which will happen in the child from birth to 7 years. And that would be one area only, which is cognitive development. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No.
Now, when we look at the second stage that we want to cover, not the second stage, but the second area that we want to cover, apart from understanding cognitive development, is neurological and brain development. Now, when we do talk about the neurological and brain development, what we are essentially looking at here would be to relate to the skills, the development one, which is happening primarily from a point of view of the increase in knowledge and the physical growth which is happening, wherein it is transforming the child's, and you'd see physical signs of this happening on the child's body, which would mean that the weight is increasing, the body structure is increasing. And in some cases, you would also look at internally when they perform certain tasks and exercises which are a part of the medical examination. They would also look at the development of brain. And in this case, the brain starts to develop just, when we talk about the fetus developing in the womb, the brain starts to develop after a few weeks of conception. And it's generally considered to be the most complex organ which is developing within the fetuses, because it is the one which actually ends up creating all the connections, or the neural connections, I should say, which would actually transmit information to the entire body. And when we look at the early years of development from a neurological point of view and brain development point of view, the first 8 years, when we look at the first 8 years up from birth to 8 years, we will see that it plays a very vital role, in the development of the child overall. And during this period, what we do get to see is that the foundations for most of the, learnings which the child would essentially have would happen in these years. And the brain capacity is increasing every year, every day, every month of the week, every week of the month, every month of the year. And you generally see that the brain capacity continues to enlarge till the child gets into an adolescence stage. And brain development is influenced by obviously genetics. It is also influenced by experiences which the child is having in the wider society, and these would essentially allow the child to develop connections, and obviously remember everyday experiences that they're having. And this would then allow the child to start using some of these abilities, which is rational thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, recognition, memory, and those kind of abilities would generally be seen that are part and parcel of the neurological and brain development which we want to see having in the child, having from 0 to 7 or 0 to 8 years. Now, obviously, there are lots of studies which have been carried out. One of the studies which have been carried out, primarily talks about the study in terms of longitudinal study, which was conducted over a 20-year period. And this particular study found that there is a correlation between actual mental simulation that the child receives at the age of 4 and the development of cortex, which is the development of brain, the two halves of the brain, in terms of dedicated language and cognition in later, which is seen, as a connection, or there's a connection between them when the childrens grow up from being a toddler go through toddler, being an adolescence, and then go through and become an adult. And what we also understand when we talk about this particular research, that the physical structure of the brain, may develop, and that development might not be visual, but we generally get to see the enlargement of cranium, the facial features, and obviously the skull side of things, which do not show a lot of enlargement, but obviously there's a lot of development happening within the brain, which is maybe not visible to the eye, but in such cases, you would see that the brain is able to develop, functions which are primarily going to help us remember and have experiences, in terms of, years and years to come. So it starts to develop memory. It starts to develop, critical abilities which are required. And here is where the theory, Vygotsky's theory, comes into play, because his particular theory, when we talk about neurological and brain development at the age of 0 to 7, is he proposed that it's very crucial, and it's a very rapid process which happens in the child's brain. And the brain undergoes obviously a significant growth, but it also shapes up into having a profound impact on how the physical development of the child also happens. And some of the key points that he proposed, in terms of obviously the research that was carried out, is that 90% of the child's brain grows, and the growth happens before the age of 5. So you would generally see, in some cases, if we do get to hear sometimes and see sometimes that the child has extra ordinary abilities, and generally you would see that happening if the child's brain development is sufficiently happened, and you would normally see Some children start to walk at the age of 9, some 9 months. Some children walk at 10 months, some 11, some take 12 to 15 months to start walking. And this is primarily because the neurological and the brain development happening allows the body to, start exercising certain functions, which would allow the child to start to do some of these activities. And that would be one such sign wherein we speak and talk about, neurological and brain development. Now, in general, there are lots of things which will tend to happen. Some of these would be visible, or they would be essentially showing visible signs. In some cases, some of these developments would not be visible to the human eye. But when we do look at, I want to bring in for example, a picture. And when we do look in to how this development of brain is essentially happening, let me try and see if I can bring some part of it as a diagram. So here, if you see, it shows how the development of brain generally is happening in a child between 0 to 7 years. So this is how the brain is at 25 days, the red part of it, which is forebrain. Then the 40 days midbrain gets formed. Then the brain stem gets formed in 100 days. 7 months, you would generally see the brain almost fully formed with most of the components of the brain. 9 months, by the time the delivery happens, you would generally see the brain is fully formed. Now, in terms of further growth, which is happening in the brain, you would see a bit of enlargement, which is happening, and the development of various organs within the brain, specifically the pituitary, the thalamus, and these kind of brain, organs start to take up their function, although they are already formed at the time of birth, but they start performing and start taking up some of the functions which we generally get to see when we talk about the neurological and brain development happening as a second part that we want to look at understanding, in stages and sequences of development which is happening within the brain. Any questions on this so far?
No.
Right.
No.
Okay. Now the next one that we look at is primarily focused on speech, language, and communication. Now here, what we are looking at in terms of understanding speech, language, and communication is basically when we talk about early years, what we are looking at is the babies begin to communicate their needs and wants. So, for example, they will have some routines in which the baby, if they are not able to speak, they will cry. They will, become a bit irritable. They would, let's say, sometimes start banging their hands on the table if they are on a chair or on some sort of a platform, and they would try and attract attention. So here, from 0 to 1 years, from birth to 1 year, that will be mostly the pattern. But when we start looking at anything from 2 to 5 years or 2 to 7 years, what you'll look at is in the second year, the child tends to remember words. And one of the key things that we want to focus on in terms of measurements, which is recorded in the book, is that the child is able to recognize about at least 50 words. By the age of 3, the child should be able to recognize about 1,000 words. So these are milestones that we want to see when we do discuss, things like, speech, language, and communication development in the early years. And what we are looking at typically is that this starts with the aspect or the phenomenon of something called babbling. I don't know if as parents you are familiar, but sometimes you would get to see the children start to babble, blah, 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 blah. They start talking in their own language, and mothers tend to understand that particular language. So babbling tends to then progress into the development of speech. At some stage, they start to repeat some of the words. They have a very acute accent of pronouncing some of the words because this is all being, developed as they go along in terms of the growth which is happening in their body. And they would start to then, after babbling, they progress to imitating some sounds, the words that they get to hear, they start repeating those words, after the parents or after caregivers, or if they are in a creche or a nursery, they will start to repeat some of these words. And this would be aiding in their language development because children are actually involving themselves in acquiring vocabulary, and they will be following the sounds and the way the words are being pronounced, and this would essentially allow them to start picking up some of the things around from their environment. And overall, this will lead to the development of what is called speech. And at some stage, this will get into language when they start recognizing 50 words at the age of 2, 1,000 words up to the age of 3. And then at some stage, connecting these dots or connecting these words would essentially mean that the children would start to then start to communicate by constructing and talking in broken English or broken language, whichever language they speak, and that communication would be understood by the parents first, the caregivers, or the people which are in the near vicinity that the child interacts with on a daily basis, and slowly and gradually by others when we look at their other part of the or others in the other set of people or group of people in the social environment. So here, the child is looking at acquiring vocabulary, grammatical structures, and they are looking at expanding their vocabulary throughout the early years. That means pronouncing and remembering newer words and then putting them into smaller sentences or sentences which will make some words which are sequenced together to be able to make sense when they talk in terms of sentences. Now, the practical applications for us in terms of this part is that the child tends to understand how to communicate, how to ask, and in some cases how to provide information apart from using some bodily gestures or obviously crying in most cases that we get to see from the birth to the year 1 there, because their language, speech, and communication skills are not developed. Any questions on this?
No, it's
No,
fine.
that's all.
Right. The next one that we look at is physical development. So physical development, when we talk about, in terms of early years, what we are looking at is the physical development basically means how the structure in the body and, the growth is essentially happening within the child. This physical development would be, critical for the child's overall growth. It encompasses things like increase in weight, increase in height, growth in terms of limbs. You would also look at growth in terms of their motor skills, which is looking at crawling, walking, running, jumping, because children at this age, typically between the age of, I would say 3 to 7, look at, jumping on trampolines and, other areas when you take them out to park or, places in terms of play areas, you generally see children tend to experiment with walking, jumping, running, and they are basically building up their muscle strength. So when we talk about motor skills, in this case, we will talk about gross motor skills, overall motor skills that they are looking at developing. And in this case, the physical development would be focused on obviously children from 0 to 1 or 2, primarily crawling and walking. But when we look at between the age of 2 to 7, we'll be focused on running, jumping, walking, and experimenting with other types of physical movements or physical play that they would be wanting to engage in, and this would be helping in promoting their strength and overall body coordination. So in some cases, one of the practical examples that I would give, as a parent, is that some children like to then start balancing, and then they start to learn how to ride a bicycle. So initially, it'll go through a period of trial and error, period of, obviously having a lot of falls, but at some stage, their body and their motor skills will allow them to balance, and they will start, biking. So one of the main activities which generally happens and the physical movement is the development of motor skills, and these gross motor skills would be termed as walking, jumping, running, and crawling, and helping them to build muscle tissue and muscle mass. Then we also look at fine motor skills. Now when we talk about fine motor skills, within that, the reason of classification is that within these, what we are also looking at is their involvement in terms of using their motor skills to do some tasks which are going to be activity-driven tasks, things like writing. So within fingers, placement of a pencil or a pen, essentially allowing them to develop dexterity which is the ability to be able to use hands and fingers to perform tasks, grasping a cup, their own bottle, milk bottle, for example, or picking up objects with their hand and knowing how much pressure to apply and how much is too much or how much is less, wherein the things fall. Sometimes we would pick up a glass and they'll slip through their hands. But when I say baby, I mean children between the age of 5 to 7, they would not be able to understand how much pressure to apply. And sometimes if it happens once, it won't happen again because they've learned from the experience. So experience of holding pencils, say, for example, buttoning a shirt, or in some cases, using certain objects like scissors or any sharp objects at that age, which parents don't need to worry about because they understand that these are objects which, if not used properly, can cause a harm. But there are these finer objects which they would, or activities that they will start to do, and they would be essential for them to start building their language and communication skills in some cases. Like if I say writing would be defined as fine motor skills. And then the physical growth aspect of it, which is what we want to look at in this case. So in this case, in this age, between the age of 2 to 6 years or 7 years, you would typically see that the child will experience what is called physical growth. Clothes tend to become shorter. Their nutritional requirements tend to increase because babies and children, burn a lot of calories. So they might have 4 or 5 meals a day, and you would generally see that they would normally put on, height or gain weight, and that tends to be during this particular period wherein physical growth is seen within the child. Is that okay? Any
Yes, thank
questions on
you.
this?
Yes.
Okay, good stuff. Then we look at the last aspect that we want to explore in this case is the personal, social, and emotional things that or activities that we see, which we are going to see, which are going to be important for the overall growth from a perspective of the early stages of development. So here again, we will fall back on the four theories which we need to be aware of. Because when we talk about infancy, we talked about the child being a toddler, and then from toddler to preschool, 3 to 5, just before they go to nursery. Then we talk about, early years between 5 to 7, and they enter into primary school. What we are looking at is they will be developing a range of personal, social, and emotional skills, which will be useful for them to comprehensively explore and reference lots of things that they can then bring into their play in terms of dealing with wider people or community or friends and with wider members within the family. So when we talk about the social, emotional, and personal milestones, what we are essentially looking at here is focusing on the development, which is crucial for the overall growth of the child. And then this would mean that we'd be looking at the children essentially, and say, for example, the caregivers, parents, the wider family would then start to look at, when I say emotional development, it would be things like trust and mistrust. So would the child trust that person? Would the child not trust that person? That will be because of certain outcomes that they've seen in the past or experienced in the past. So when we look at emotional development, it is going to be allowing them to, look at understanding, I would say, let's say their own feelings and how they would use these feelings then to express, understand, and regulate some of the emotions to get things done. So it is going to be related to their ability to essentially recognize, express, and obviously manage their feelings to get, sometimes things that they want from their parents or near dear ones. So sometimes you would see a baby would throw a lot of tantrums to say, no, I want this chocolate, I want this chocolate. And what they're trying to do is, using their experience to essentially blackmail or emotionally blackmail the parent to say, this is something I need it now. And they would create enough impressions and ideas or pressure to get what they are wanting, because this is the use of what is called emotional pressure with the parents. So this involves understanding their feelings, understanding what they can get when they show this particular behavior, And in some cases, the recognition of emotions allows them to, also then, understand what is happiness, what is sadness, when this is turning into anger or when this is turning into fear. And this particular part, to identify and label them as that this is a happy moment or this is a sad moment or this is a moment in which I can get anything from the parent, would be basically the emotions that they are going to develop and understand, and how to regulate them and how to use them is going to be the part of the development at this particular stage. Now, when we also refer to, say, for example, social side of things, what we are looking at is when we talk about social development, what we are looking at in this case is primarily how they are going to be able to improve their relations with people that they deal with, or people they get in touch with on a daily basis. And this social development would essentially mean that they would be understanding the requirements in terms of, understand the requirements in terms of how they learn to interact with others around them. And this part would be the part that they tend to then emulate. And, say, for example, one example that I would give you is, for example, parents sometimes, if they have guests coming over, what they would ask the child to do essentially is share toys. And when we look at the example of sharing toys, you would see that in this case, the child would learn the importance of obviously why he or she has been asked to share toys, and understand the concept of fairness. So sometimes they would try and grab a bigger chunk of the chocolate, or want the entire thing to themselves, and the parents would explain that this is something that you can't do, you also have to share it with your sibling. And that would be the aspect of social development which the child would be essentially going through at this particular stage. These are examples that we have to look at to understand, I would say, social development. And when we talk about the various theories, the Vygotsky's theory of social development is the one that we need to look at in particular. And that theory essentially, makes the child understand that this is my zone. This is the zone in which I cannot do these things. And this is the zone in which if I do these things, then I'm in the proximity of either getting, some sort of, let's say some sort of, sometimes, parents, what they will do is they'll instruct them to do not to do this. So in certain places, they would be, in a zone wherein they cannot take chances, because that is a no-go zone, or that is a zone or an area wherein the parents would not allow that activity to happen. So when we look at this particular, theoretical model, which was proposed by Lev, Vygotsky, he developed this model because he says there are zones, and the zones essentially allow, the interactions to be influenced, and that would allow the child to grow personally and socially, and that would, allow them to say be able to understand that these are things that they can do, these are things that they cannot do, and this is a certain type of behavior which is acceptable. This type of behavior is certainly not acceptable. And that would be the personal, social, and emotional development, which we will see, which starts to happen, when we talk about this aspect of the initial stages and sequence of development, which happens within the child from 1 to the age of 7. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No.
I've given some examples here on the slide, which basically would, talk about babies having eye contact when they play a game. They try and emulate some of the expressions which the parents are showing. And those are the bits that we would need to know when we talk about, this first assessment criteria. Now, one other thing which I would very briefly cover, which is the term holistic development for today. Now, when we talk about holistic development, as I mentioned, if I just put this here in a slide, explain holistic development. And when I look at holistic development, these are the parts that we are looking at, from a child's activity point of view, because we are looking at all of them together. That is something that we want to understand when we talk about holistic development. So we are looking at the development of language skills, obviously cognitive skills. We're looking at social and emotional side of skills, which is related to the sociocultural theory, and then the physical skills or development, which we get to see, physical growth and development, which we get to see within the child in terms of the fine motor skills, the gross motor skills that we talked about. And these are bits that we talk about when we talk about the term, holistic development. So there are obviously key elements to it, but when we do talk about, holistic development, one of the key things that we have to keep in mind is that here, as a carer, in the early years of practice, you practicing or working with children, you have to pay attention to children's physical, personal, social, and emotional well-being of the child. And here the holistic approach the holistic development approach is important, because it is going to be helpful for you to plan and assess the need and wants of the children, or a child in this case. So if you understand these four or five broad areas, sometimes it is also the fifth area tends to be the intellectual or spiritual area. But if you understand these five areas, then you are going to be able to assess the child as an individual, and that will help you understand, what they want, what are the areas in which they are lacking development, what are the areas in which they are keeping up with the pace of development as it is required at this age, and how they are going to progress in the future, and what could be the factors that are affecting the progress in a particular area. Sometimes you would see children being physically very active, but when it comes to using other abilities in terms of cognitive abilities or social abilities, they might not show them. So in such cases, what tends to happen is we look at the process of holistic development and then focus on doing certain types of activities with the child, so that they are able to pick up and understand what are the areas in which they are lacking. You are able to pick up and make them understand and do activities accordingly to be able to help that particular bit to happen. That means help that if the physical side of things are very well developed, then emotional, language, or cognitive side or social side needs to be worked on. And those would be, things that you would do generally with child or children by carrying out a number of activities or doing specific activities which make the child more comfortable and feel safe within a particular environment, and thereby the child then connects with you to overcome some of those areas in which they lack these skills. And that would be the focus of holistic development. So here the idea is to allow the children to develop all the areas together at the same time. And most of the activities that you get to see, which are carried out by teachers in nursery between the age of 5 and 7, all these activities that they carry out, they tend to cover all the types of needs. So they will take you across to, say, as a children, they will take you across to the Muga or outside in a playground, and they would have some physical activity, some team building activity. That you wouldn't be able to, do some of the things on their own, and you would be put into groups to be able to perform some of these activities, and that would allow in developing social skills, in your physical skills, the skills that you need for problem solving or identifying, and in some cases also then language and speech and communication skills, which will allow you to become a part of that group and then participate in that activity. So those are the things that have to be discussed when we talk about holistic development. And the advantages of holistic development is that it allows the child to grow mentally, and it also allows physiological, social, and emotional growth to happen, because they're able to connect with other similar child at the same age group, or other similar children in the same age group, which allows them to develop better communication and social skills, thereby giving them greater confidence. And that is why the focus is on holistic assessment. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good stuff. Any questions on today's session? So that brings us to the end, because what we have looked at in a bit more detail today is the stages and the sequence of development which happens from birth to 7 years. But the focus has been to understand these across these 5 areas, and that is what the learning outcome 2 is.
No, not from me. I just wanted to know, Raman, how much detail do you need in the assessment or assignment? Do you want, like for the holistic development question, do you want paragraphs or do you want tables? How much detail are you wanting us to give?
I think what I would suggest is that sometimes, because the way the assessment criteria are given, they give you a bit of a tip to say that if these are words or key phrases which are mentioned, they would need to at least be identified and defined. One of the things that you will note is that in the assessment criteria, like in this case, if I just go back to the beginning, it says 2.1. It says identify stages and sequences. So identification typically tends to be, one is to bullet point them and identify that these are the, key things that you are going to discuss or mention essentially. So identify is point out, you're going to give us a list of some of the main features. That is what identify means. So when you list them out, you can list them out like this, but when it says sequences, so here my suggestion would be, when I talk about cognitive development, you explain that in 20 to 30 words. When I look at neurological and brain development, again, 20 to 30 words. And that would be going through and covering this task comprehensively. So focus would be to understand, what are the command verbs. So in this case, it is identify. Yesterday's most of the command verbs were describe and explain. And explain essentially means that you need to set out in detail the meaning of something. And describe is clear description, which basically includes relevant features or various stages. So, for example, in some cases, I would suggest that you include, diagrams, to explain certain parts. So in the early stages of development, from conception to birth, my suggestion would be to include a lot of diagrams, or pictures essentially, which will help you put a bit of a kind of a story, and then you are able to then explain or elaborate briefly on the key parts of it to be able to cover that task. So identify typically tends to be between 75 to maximum, I would say, 100 words. Explain tends to be between 50 to 125 words, depending on if it's. So if I break something down and it says key stages of development from conception to birth, I'd probably pick up the key phrases when I look at explaining. So what is, what are the stages of development? So I will start with 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5, 5 to 6, and maybe do a table. And within that table, on the left-hand side, I've mentioned the years. On the right-hand side, I would basically mention 10 to 15 words to cover that up. And then if you want to go over the top, you put a bit of an image or a table or a picture, which is relevant to that. And then you use that to be able to explain, and that would basically do it. But most of these tasks that we're going to discuss, as we go into higher learning outcomes, say 3, 4, I think 3 or 4 are also going to be focused on describe and explain. But when we go to 4 and 5, which are the last 2 learning outcomes, you will see that the complexity of these command verbs will also go up. So they'll have analyze or discuss or evaluate, and that is where you would need to start putting more text in, because you would need to discuss, bring some arguments in. You might need to review a bit of information which has been provided. And reviewing that information means that you will need to explain that term, give an example, and then move to the next one, then move to the next one, and then put a wrapper around it to say what is it, the overall bit that you've covered, and how is it related to the task. And that is where your write-ups will increase from 125 to 150 word, or even 200 words in some cases, if it says critically evaluate or evaluate in general. And sometimes in these 2 units that we're going to study, most of the tasks are going to be identify, plan, discuss, explain. So when it says plan, you have to do a planning. That means you would need to create an activity or show an actual planning of the activity, how it is done. So for example, if as a early years teacher, I take children out to the Muga, which is the play area, then what is the activity which is planned for the day today? So if it says plan an activity for the children, if the task says, I'm just hypothetically taking an example, then you would need to basically plan an activity, and that could be a playtime activity or a writing activity or a painting activity or some sort of a peekaboo activity. But that is planning. You need to show how you plan the activity. So it is a
Okay, so
step. It is just a stepwise detailing of that activity.
Okay, so like for example, I know we're not there yet, obviously, but when you want to plan activity for children from birth to 5 years in relation to, and then I've listed cognitive development, etc. So you need the detail on the activity. So if you're exploring textures, how are you going to explore those textures? For example, you're going to have a bucket with various different types of textures in it, and allow baby to feel and talk about the textures or something like that. Is that what you need more detail on that sort of thing?
Yeah, in some cases, yes. When we look at Unit
Okay.
2, I think there would be some focus on, getting those details. And obviously, they would be then requiring you to detail out some of these activities which can be, essentially done.
Okay.
So there are activity planning charts, and, sometimes you give them an empty page to say, let's draw a picture of a fruit that you like.
Yeah.
That is a page that you've prepared, which has a bit of a border around it, and it says draw a picture, and you give them some pencils or colored pens and things like that, and then show them a chart which will be basically different types of fruit. And then you say, you pick up your favorite fruit and let's draw it out by looking at the picture. And that's an activity that you've done for that, with a group of children to start them off during the course of their day, something of that sort. So that is how we'll be going into those basic set of activity planning. I think that will be covered, uh, and some part of it will be required in Unit 2.
Yes, yeah. Now these ones I think are further down the line.
Yeah, and as you rightly said, you were working with 4 and 5-year-old children, so these type of activities would vary. At the very basic, at 0 to 2 years, 3 years, they'll be playing with toys, organizing, and making sure that you are cleaning up when you leave the play area. But these would change to other type of activities for children which are in the age of 4 to 5 or 5 to 6 or 6 to 7.
Yeah, so I like, for example, I broke it down to for sort of under 1 year, then 1 to 2 years, then 3 to 5 sort of years. Is
That's
that
correct.
sort
Yeah,
of,
depending on, it could be different set of activities that if there is an example which is asked, then you could pick out one that you feel comfortable with, or you've done it in the past, or you've actually practically done it. You could reproduce that for the evidence in the assignment, and that would be good enough. You don't need to revisit all of them together. That I've done it from this year 1 to 2, 2 to 3. It'll be very specific. It'll just say one activity or a set of activities, and you might have to, I think in the assignment too, there are 2 or 3 such tasks which will ask you to detail out one type of activity. And that could be visually you are presenting with some pictures. And, say, for example, sometimes you have the PE, which you take them across to, and you'd basically prepare a bit of a handout in terms of what the activity would be involving. So that would be the planning side of things that you will need to show. It could be that they go into a physical area, they get dressed, and you do the jumping and walking, or require some equipment, resource requirements, and then you detail it out. Okay, for this activity, are there any issues in terms of any risk assessment will be done, if I use the correct word. So those are the bits that you would detail out as a teacher, as a person who's working with children during those years, or in the early years.
okay. Brilliant, thank you.
Good stuff. So I think what we'll do is we'll now be catching up next week, and that will be looking at learning outcome 3. I don't think there is a session tomorrow on Friday, but it'll be Thursdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays. So what I'm going to do is, for these 2 learning outcomes and the others, I'm going to start detailing out some of the slides. So be sure to look at these presentations over the weekend, because I'll probably detail out some of these slides that I'm discussing, because some part of it is predominantly coming from my own memory, but and also looking at, as a parent, the experience that I've had. But what I'm going to do is, over the weekend, I'm going to kind of detail out these slides, and these slides will go into what I'm actually verbatim and verbatim explaining to you, and then going through. I will add some handouts like I added for learning outcome 1 yesterday, today for learning outcome 2, but the presentations will become slightly more detailed over the weekend, because I will refine them from learning outcome 1 to 5, so that you're able to get, I would say, 70-80% of what I'm discussing verbally, but it'll come through the slides.
Okay.
Good stuff. So thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you.
Yeah, go on.
No, I say thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for attending. And I'll make sure that the copy of recording and these updates typically happen in the next few minutes. I'll drop you a text message on the WhatsApp group, and then I'll catch up with you next week.
Okay, bye.
Take care. Thank you. Bye. Bye for now.